My husband announced he was leaving me for my own stepsister, right in front of me and our 3 children. 8 months later, he married her. She looked at me across the dinner table that night and said, "Don't make this ugly." I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I made one phone call instead, and by the time the two of them walked out that door holding hands like they'd just won something, I already knew their future together wouldn't be what they imagined. My name is Emberly Winslow. For 11 years, I believed my family was the one thing in my life that could never be taken from me. I was wrong, but not in the way you'd expect. Because what happened in my living room that night wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of theirs falling apart, piece by piece, exactly the way they deserved. I need to take you back to the beginning because none of this makes sense unless you understand how Sage and I became sisters in the first place. We weren't born that way. My father, Anders, married her mother, Celeste. When I was 9 and Sage was 11, I remember the wedding like it was yesterday. A small backyard ceremony, string lights, Sage in a yellow dress that she hated because she wanted to wear black like she thought made her look older. From the very first day, Sage had this way of positioning herself as the interesting one, the dramatic one, the one people paid attention to. I was the quiet stepdaughter who did her homework and helped set the table. She was the one who cried the loudest, laughed the hardest, and always, somehow ended up in the center of every photograph. I don't say this with resentment. For a long time, I loved her the way you love a sister you didn't choose but grew into anyway. We shared a bathroom, fought over clothes, and covered for each other when we snuck out as teenagers. When I met Liam my sophomore year of college, Sage was the first person I called. She squealed into the phone and told me he sounded perfect for me. She was in my wedding, standing right beside me in a pale green dress, dabbing at her. During the vows and telling everyone afterward that she'd never seen two people more suited to each other, she held my hand in the hospital room when Chase was born, and again 2 years later when the twins, Lyra and Velyra, came into the world screaming loud enough to wake the entire maternity ward. She showed up with casseroles during those exhausted newborn weeks, folded tiny onesies while I slept, and told me more than once that watching Liam with our children made her believe good men still existed. For years, I thought of Sage as one, the steadiest people in my life, even as her own life kept coming apart around her. My father used to joke that Sage collected beginnings the way other people collect souvenirs. Bright, exciting, and eventually shoved into a drawer and forgotten. As kids, she was the one who convinced me to skip school for a concert 2 states away. The one who talked our parents into a later curfew on my behalf, because she knew exactly which arguments worked on them. I adored her for it. I never once considered that the same restlessness that made her fun to grow up with might years later make her impossible to build a life around. Looking back now, I can see the cracks that were always there, faint hairline fractures I chose not to examine too closely. Sage never seemed to stay anywhere for long, not in jobs, not in cities, and certainly not in marriages. Her first marriage happened fast, right out of college to a man named Desmond who adored her completely. It lasted barely 2 years before she filed, telling our family that he'd stopped growing with her. Her second marriage came 4 years later to a man she met on a work trip, and that one didn't even last 18 months. Both times she showed up on my doorstep with suitcases and a story about how misunderstood she'd been, and both times I let her stay with us while she got back on her feet. Liam never objected. He'd hug her when she arrived, tell her our home was her home too, and help carry her bags up to the guest room like it was the most natural thing in the world. The years between the twins' birth and that last anniversary dinner were, by most measures, good ones. Liam worked in regional sales, which meant stretches of travel followed by weeks at home where he threw himself into being present. Coaching Chase's youth baseball team, building an elaborate blanket for it with the twins that took up half our living room for an entire summer. Learning to braid hair badly, but enthusiastically, because Lyra asked him to. I worked steadily as a project coordinator, proud of the career I'd built, while still managing to be home for dinner most nights. We weren't a perfect family. We argued about money sometimes, about whose turn it was to handle the school pickup schedule, about the ordinary friction that comes with raising 3 young children under one roof. But underneath it, I believed we were solid. I believed the foundation was real. I want to be honest about something because this story only works if I am. There were small moments over the years that I brushed away because I didn't want to believe they meant anything the way Liam would laugh a little too easily at Sage's jokes, the way he remembered details about her life that I hadn't told him, the way she'd rest her hand on his shoulder a beat too long when she said goodnight. I told myself I was being paranoid, that a woman who has been cheated on before starts seeing shadows where there aren't any. I had never been cheated on, but some instinct in me kept a quiet ledger anyway, adding up small things I couldn't yet name. The last time Sage's marriage ended about 8 months before everything came apart. She moved in with us again while she figured things out. This time something felt different, though I couldn't have told you what. She stayed longer than usual. She started going to the gym with Liam in the mornings. She began cooking dinner some nights before I got home from work, claiming she just wanted to help out since she wasn't paying rent. I told myself I should be grateful. Instead, I started sleeping worse. I started noticing how often Liam's phone was face down on the counter. How quiet the house felt when the two of them were in a room together, and I walked in. I mentioned some of this once to my closest friend Josephine over coffee on a Tuesday morning. I still remember clearly. I told her I felt ridiculous even saying it out loud, that I had no proof of anything, just a feeling I couldn't shake. Josephine didn't tell me I was imagining things, and she didn't tell me I was right either. She just squeezed my hand and said something I've carried with me ever since, that a woman doesn't need proof to start protecting herself, only a reason to be careful. That conversation stayed with me longer than I expected it to. I never confronted either of them directly, not at first. Instead, I did something that surprised even me. Quietly, without telling anyone, I made an appointment with a family law attorney named Vivian Roswell, a woman a coworker had recommended years earlier, just in case. I told myself it was only a precaution, that I was being overly cautious the way I always was. Vivian asked me a lot of questions that day, about our finances, about the house, about whose name was on what. It turned out that mattered more than I ever expected it would. The house we lived in had come to me through my mother's estate 2 years before Liam and I married, and I had never added his name to the deed, mostly out of habit rather than any deliberate plan. Vivian explained that because I'd inherited it before the marriage and had never added Liam to the deed, it had a strong claim to being treated as separate property, though she was. To tell me nothing was guaranteed. Things like commingled funds or money spent on the house during the marriage could complicate that claim, and it would ultimately depend on how our finances had actually been handled over the years. She also walked me through what a legal separation of our joint accounts would look like if it ever came to that, and helped me understand in plain terms what documentation I would need if I ever had to move quickly to protect myself and the kids. I left her office that day feeling foolish for having gone at all. I kept the paperwork anyway, tucked into a folder at the back of a drawer, and told myself I'd probably never need it. 6 months later, on the night of our 11th wedding anniversary, I needed it. I had planned a quiet dinner at home, nothing extravagant, just the 5 of us in a homemade meal, because Liam had said he wanted something simple that year. Sage was still living with us at the time, and she offered to help me cook, which should have felt kind and instead made my stomach tighten in a way I didn't examine too closely. Chase set the table without being asked, proud of himself the way an 8-year-old gets proud over small responsibilities. Lyra and Velyra, 6 years old and inseparable, argued over who got to light the candles, a job neither of them was actually allowed to do, which resulted in the usual negotiation over who got to blow them out instead. Dinner started normally enough. Liam raised a toast to 11 years, and I remember thinking even then how strange it was that his eyes didn't quite meet mine when halfway through the meal, he sat down his fork, looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, something between guilt and relief, and said he needed to tell me something. My first thought, absurdly, was that he'd lost his job. I wasn't prepared for what came next. He said he was in love with Sage. He said it had been building for a long time, longer than either of them had meant for it to. He said he wanted a divorce, and that he and Sage wanted to be honest with everyone, rather than continue living a lie. The children went still. Chase's fork clattered against his plate. Lyra started crying before she even understood what was happening, the way small children do when they sense the temperature of a room change. Sage sat there beside him, not even flinching, and when I turned to look at her, silently asking her to tell me this was some kind of horrible joke, she reached across the table, touched my hand, and said the words that I will never forget as long as I live. "Don't make this ugly. I want to tell you," I screamed. "I want to tell you I threw something, that I sobbed, that I demanded answers in front of my children the way television shows tell us betrayed women are supposed to. I didn't." Something in me went very still and very clear. The way water goes still right before it freezes. I looked at my 3 children, watched Chase pull his sisters closer to him like he already understood he needed to protect them, and I stood up from the table without raising my voice. I told Liam and Sage that I told them I wouldn't make a scene in front of the kids, and then I walked into the other room, picked up my phone and made one phone call. It wasn't to a friend. It wasn't to my father. It was to Vivian Roswell. I had kept her number saved for 6 months, half hoping I'd never use it. That night I used it. In under 4 minutes. I confirmed exactly what she had already told me during our first meeting, that the deed and the timeline gave me a strong position on the house, and that we needed to move carefully. But quickly, to make sure it stayed that way, I asked her to begin the process of formally separating our joint accounts first thing the next morning, before either of them had the chance to move money anywhere. I asked her what documentation I needed to protect primary custody, given that I had been the children's primary caregiver for years while Liam traveled for work. By the time I hung up, Liam and Sage were already upstairs packing a bag, moving quickly. The way people move when they think they're finally free, they walked out that door within the hour. Sage's hand in Liam's, both of them practically glowing with the relief of people who believe they've just escaped something. What they didn't know yet was that they hadn't escaped anything. They had walked directly into the consequences I had quietly prepared for without either of them noticing for 6 months. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life, and I won't pretend otherwise for the sake of a tidy story. I had 3 children to explain this to. 3 children who woke up some mornings asking why Daddy? Home and Wyatt. Sage wasn't either. Chase, being older, understood more than I wanted him to. He asked me once, very quietly, if it was his fault somehow, and it broke something in me to have to explain, gently and repeatedly, that it wasn't. Lyra and Velyra were younger, and their grief came out sideways, in tantrums and nightmares and a sudden need to sleep in my bed most nights. I held them through it, all 3 of them, and I did not fall apart because I understood somewhere underneath the exhaust that they needed to see that our family, even broken, was still standing. In those first raw weeks, it was Josephine who showed up almost every evening with dinner she hadn't asked permission to bring, who sat on my kitchen floor with me at midnight more than once while I stared at nothing and tried to remember how to breathe normally. She never once told me what to feel. She just kept showing up, which, it turns out, was exactly what I needed most. The children's adjustment came in waves I hadn't prepared for. Chase started asking practical questions, the kind that told me he was trying to control something in a world that suddenly felt unpredictable. Where he'd sleep on which nights, whether he'd still play on his baseball team, whether his sisters were going to be okay. I answered every question as honestly as I could, even when the honest answer was simply that I didn't know yet. Laura began drawing pictures of our family with a strange gap where her father used to stand, and it took months of gentle, patient conversation, along with a few sessions with a counselor who specialized in children of divorce, before those drawings started looking whole again. Velyra, the quieter of the twins, talking about it almost entirely, which worried me more than her sister's tears did, until one night, she crawled into my lap and simply said she missed how loud our house used to be. I held her and told her it would be loud again. It took time, but I was right. The legal process moved the way these things actually move, which is to say slowly, methodically, without the dramatic single-moment television promises. Vivian filed the paperwork arguing the house should remain my separate property, and after reviewing the lead in our financial records, Liam's own attorney chose not to contest it, since the timeline and documentation left him little room to argue otherwise. The joint accounts were split according to what had actually been contributed by each of us, verified through the bank's standard review process, which took the better part of 2 months and turned up something I hadn't expected. Liam had, over the previous year, been quietly withdrawing larger amounts than usual and transferring them into an account Sage had opened under her own name. Money, he later claimed, was meant to help her get back on her feet during her most recent divorce. The bank's review flagged the pattern, and while nothing about it rose to a criminal matter, it meant that when our finances were untangled, a significant portion of what should have gone toward our children's college funds had already quietly disappeared into Sage's name. Months before the anniversary dinner that ended my marriage, Vivian walked me through the findings line by line, patiently, the way she'd walked me through everything else, and I remember sitting in her office feeling less angry than and more strangely validated, as though some quiet, watchful part of me had known all along that the ledger I'd been keeping in my head wasn't paranoid after all. We worked together over the following weeks to recover what we reasonably could, primarily by adjusting the division of remaining marital assets to account for what had already left the household, a process Liam's own attorney didn't fight nearly as hard as I expected him to, perhaps because Liam himself was eager by then to simply move forward. Custody worked out in a way that felt, for the first time in weeks, like the world had some fairness left in it. Because I had been the children's primary caregiver for years, and because Liam had voluntarily left the household and moved in with Sage within days of our separation, the court granted me primary custody with a structured parenting schedule for Liam. It wasn't a punishment, it was simply a reflection of the life we had actually been living, made official on paper. What I hadn't expected was how quickly the rest of our extended family began to piece together the truth about Sage's history. My father, devastated and furious in equal measure, started asking questions about her 2 previous marriages that none of us had ever really examined too closely. Desmond, her first husband, reached out to my father months later, almost apologetically, to say he'd always suspected there was someone else near the end of their marriage, but had never had anything solid enough to say so out loud until he heard what happened to me. Her second marriage was murkier. Nobody could point to a single clear reason it had. Only a general sense from the few people who'd stayed close to that ex-husband that Sage had grown distant and unreachable in the final months, the same quiet withdrawal that seemed to precede all of her endings, whether or not another man was involved. My family, who had spent years making room for Sage at every holiday table, quietly began to close ranks anyway, less because every detail was confirmed and more because the pattern itself had finally become impossible to ignore. Celeste, her own mother, called me crying, apologizing for a daughter she said she no longer recognized. My father stopped speaking to Sage entirely. It wasn't dramatic. It was just a slow, steady withdrawal of the trust she had spent years borrowing against. That first Thanksgiving after the divorce told me almost everything I needed to know about how the rest of the family had come to see things. My father hosted as he always did, and for the first time in over a decade. Sage wasn't at the table. Nobody made a formal announcement about it. She simply wasn't invited, and nobody asked why. Because everybody already understood, Celeste came alone, quieter than usual, and thanked me privately in the kitchen for still welcoming her despite everything, as though I could ever hold a mother responsible for a grown daughter's choices. It was a strange, bittersweet holiday, full of the particular ache of a family reshaping itself around an absence everyone had chosen together. Liam and Sage married 8 months after the divorce was finalized in a small courthouse ceremony that I only heard about secondhand. Through Chase, who'd overheard his father on the phone for a while, from what little filtered back to me, through the children's weekends with him, things seemed happy enough. I told myself it didn't matter to me anymore. And mostly that was true. I was busy rebuilding a life that finally felt like mine, no longer split 3 ways trying to keep everyone content. I threw myself into the kids, into a job I'd been neglecting, into a quiet kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. It was almost exactly a year and a half later, when Chase came home from a weekend with his father and mentioned offhandedly that Sage had been really mad about money the whole visit. I didn't think much of it. At the time, children mentioned things without understanding their weight. But over the following months, the visits started shifting in small ways. Liam seemed more tired. He started picking the kids up in an older car. He mentioned once, in the careful tone of someone trying not to say too much, that things with Sage had gotten complicated. Celeste told my father, and my father eventually told me, that the early months of Liam and Sage's marriage had genuinely looked happy from the outside. There were trips, dinners out, photos of the two of them that Sage posted with captions about finally finding someone who understood her. But Celeste also said that within the first year, she'd started noticing the same quiet tension in her daughter's voice that had preceded both previous divorces, a restlessness Sage always described as outgrowing whatever she currently had. As though marriage were a pair of shoes that simply wore out with use, rather than something two people built and maintained together. What I eventually learned, mostly through my father, who had maintained a strained but ongoing relationship with Celeste, was that Sage's pattern hadn't changed at all. She had, over the course of their marriage, moved a significant amount of the money Liam had once diverted from our family into accounts under her own name, framing it as savings for their future. She had also, according to Celeste, become involved with the business partner of Liam's during a stretch when he was traveling for work. The same quiet unraveling that had once happened to me now happening to him. When Liam finally discovered it and confronted her, Sage didn't apologize. She reportedly told him something very close to what she'd once said to me at that anniversary dinner. That he shouldn't make things ugly, that people grow apart, that this was simply how life worked. She filed for divorce within the month, her third, and by the time it was finalized, she had walked away. With a substantial share of what remained of his savings protected by an agreement Liam had signed early in their marriage, back when he still believed the way I once had, that trust didn't need to be written down to be real. Chase, who by then was old enough to notice more than either of his parents probably realized, mentioned once that his father had seemed different during that last stretch. Quieter at dinner, slower to laugh. The kind of tired that had nothing to do with sleep. I didn't ask Chase to tell me more because I never wanted my children to feel like messengers between two households. But I understood, in the careful way children reveal more than they mean to, that whatever Liam was living through in that marriage had worn him down in a way our marriage never had, even at its worst. Liam reached out to me about 4 months after his divorce from Sage was finalized. He asked if we could talk, just the two of us, without the kids around. I agreed, mostly because I believed and still believe that a healthy co-parenting relationship matters more than old wounds. We met at a coffee shop and he looked different than I remembered. Thinner, quieter, the easy confidence he'd once carried replaced by something that looked a lot like regret. He apologized. He told me he understood now what he'd thrown away, that he'd spent the last year and a half watching someone treat him exactly the way we'd once, together, promised each other we never would. He said he understood if I never forgave him, but he needed to say it anyway. He asked quietly, almost as an afterthought, if there was any chance for us someday to try again. I watched him ask it, this man I had once built an entire life alongside, and felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not anger, not even the old grief, but a kind of calm certainty that surprised me with how settled it already was. I didn't shout, I didn't cry, not there in that coffee shop with strangers around us. I told him the truth, as gently and as clearly as I could. I told him that forgiveness, real forgiveness, wasn't something I owed him just because his second choice had hurt him the same way his first choice had hurt me. I told him I hoped he'd learn something real, something that would make him a better father to our children, because that was the only part of this that still connected us. But I told him that the version of trust he was asking me to rebuild had died at that dinner table in front of our children the night he decided a woman who'd already broken 2 marriages was worth more than the one he'd built with me. I told him I wished him peace. I meant it, but I would not be the place he came to find it. He nodded, and for the first time since I'd known him, he didn't argue. He simply said he understood, and thanked me for being honest with him. There was a long quiet between us after that, the kind that used to feel uncomfortable, and now just felt honest. He asked, almost hesitantly, whether I thought he was a bad father, and I told him no, without any hesitation at all, that whatever else had broken between us, the kids still lit up every time they saw him. And that mattered more than anything he and I had lost. We finished our coffee, talking carefully about the kids' school schedules instead, about Chase's upcoming baseball season and Alara's sudden interest in painting, and it felt strangely like the first genuinely peaceful conversation we'd had in years. I drove home that afternoon feeling lighter than I had in a long time, Not because I'd gotten anything back, but because I finally understood I didn't need to. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a house once it finally stops waiting for something to go wrong. It didn't arrive all at once. It came gradually and small, unremarkable moments. The first night, all 3 kids slept through without anyone waking up crying. The first time Chase laughed at dinner without glancing over to check if it was allowed. The first Sunday morning I woke up and realized I hadn't thought about Liam or Sage at all until that thought itself reminded me of them. Josephine noticed it before I did. She told me one evening, watching me laugh at something Velyra had said, that I looked like itself again in a way I hadn't in over a year. I hadn't realized how much of myself I'd been holding back until she pointed out that I'd gotten it back. It's been almost 2 years now since that anniversary dinner. Chase is 10, sharp and steady, still a little protective of his sisters in a way that breaks my heart and makes me proud all at once. Lyra and Velyra are 8, loud and joyful, again in a way that took time to come back, but did come back fully, the way children's resilience so often surprises. If we give them enough steady ground to stand on. I kept the house. I rebuilt the savings slowly, methodically, the same patient way Vivian had once taught me to protect it in the first place. I watched Sage, who spent years believing that other people's foundations were simply hers to borrow, end up with nothing steady of her own to stand on either. 3 marriages deep and no closer to whatever she'd been chasing in the first place. I heard secondhand, and without much interest, that she'd moved to another state entirely. Starting over yet again, in a place where nobody yet knew her pattern. Some part of me used to wonder whether she'd ever slow down long enough to understand why every foundation she built kept crumbling beneath her. I've stopped wondering. It was never mine to figure out. My father, in the quiet years since, has become closer to his grandchildren than I think even he expected. He shows up to Chase's games without fail, teaches the twins card games at the kitchen table on Sunday afternoons, and never once in all. This time, as he mentioned Sage's name in front of them unprompted, Celeste still calls me occasionally, gently, carefully, and I've come to understand that grief over who a child becomes is its own quiet kind of heartbreak when I try to hold space for, even though the daughter in question is the reason mine happened at all. I don't think about that night with anger anymore. Not really. I think about it as the moment I learned that the strongest thing I ever did wasn't the phone call itself. It was staying calm enough in the worst moment of my life to protect the people who actually needed protecting. Sage told me not to make it ugly. I never did. I just made sure that whatever came next, my children and I would be standing on solid ground no matter who walked out that door. If you've ever had to stay calm in the very moment your whole world was falling apart just to protect the people who needed you most, I'd love to hear how you found that strength in the comments.